Welcome to the Empowered Wife podcast, where it's all about fixing your relationship without your man's conscious effort so that you feel desired, taken care of, and special, even if your relationship feels completely hopeless. I'm Laura Doyle, and today I'm sharing 3 ways to break your family patterns. Twice a year, we host a free Adored Wife Challenge where we all experiment with applying the 6 intimacy skills together every day for 5 days. I interviewed my guest, Heather, as part of our last challenge, and she has such a hopeful and engaging story. I knew that I wanted you, dear podcast listener, to hear what she did to make her marriage last and thrive. So we asked her permission, and Heather agreed to let me share it with you. She's going to reveal what she did so you can do the same things to make your marriage last and thrive. And then I'll be giving out the Worst Relationship Advice of the Week award, which is from an article entitled Empowering Relationship Advice for Women. But it will only make you exhausted and helpless. I'll be rolling my eyes at that pretty soon. All of that's coming up. But first, let's talk about 3 ways to break your family patterns. If you're having a breakdown in your marriage, maybe you're just playing out a pattern you learned in your family. Maybe your parents were divorced, or maybe they never got married, or maybe they are married to this day, but they don't have the kind of marriage you want to emulate. There probably was no Relationships 101 at your schools. So where were you supposed to learn about how to have a good marriage? From watching Mike and Molly sitcoms? Maybe you went to marriage counseling and the counselor pointed out that your parents were lurking at the root of every problem the 2 of you were having. Maybe that's where you heard that you married your father with his terrible temper, ostensibly to work out your unresolved issues, for example. That's one way to look at the marriage between 2 mere mortal humans. And maybe your spouse's parents were also there, giving ample evidence to the therapist's assessment that he was from a dysfunctional family and therefore emotionally wounded and not able to be there for you. And okay, that's where most of us get our early training in relationships is from our families. Our parents and our siblings are our first relationships. I unwittingly copied my parents' recipe so well that I ended up with a miserable marriage, at which point I nearly got divorced, just like mom and dad did. And if I hadn't found some new and better training on relationships, I'm confident my marriage wouldn't have lasted, and all of my other relationships would also be suffering. Fortunately, there are more effective modern advances in revitalizing relationships that weren't available to our parents, who only had the TV show All in the Family with Archie Bunker to study from. Here are 3 techniques that you can practice that will help you break painful family patterns and create more peaceful, positive ones. Number 1 is my favorite. It's the spouse-fulfilling prophecy. Lee Miltier tells the story of a woman who attended her course on the power of autosuggestion and realized that she had been unwittingly using affirmations with her husband that were reinforcing behavior she did not like. Every time her husband got angry, she was affirming, "You always lose your temper." After hearing Lee speak, this woman decided to pick a new affirmation for her husband. She went home and she waited for her husband to lose his temper, which didn't take very long. And then she said, "That's not like you to lose your temper." Her husband gave her a funny look, and their 12-year-old son said, "Yes, it is, Mom. He always loses his temper." But the woman stuck to her new declaration. Not long after that, they were at a restaurant and the service was slow. And the husband was fuming and he said, "I have a good mind to call the manager over and let him know how long we've been waiting." And then he stopped and he said, "That's not like me to lose my temper, is it?" What are your affirmations for your husband? That he's always late, that he's not good with money, that he's immature, irresponsible? Are those affirmations serving you? If not, consider experimenting with some new ones. Number 2, you can RSVP not attending when your husband invites you to a fight. Whenever I'm mad at my husband, I'm also hurt. It's true every single time, even if I don't want to admit it. Anger is the defensive reaction that masks the more tender emotion underneath. Therefore, when you're mad and you want to fire off a cutting comment, a great strategy for preserving the intimacy is to use this word instead. Ouch. That's it. Just ouch. No further explanation is necessary. Even toddlers know what that means. You might still get a quizzical reaction if you change up your usual interactions this way. After all, you both know the steps to that old dance you were about to do where you hurl mean comments at each other or storm away in stony silence. But you can save the evening for both of you with a single impactful word and maybe a quick exit. Saying ouch has two big advantages. First, you preserve your own dignity. You avoid saying anything unpleasant that you'd have to apologize for later. Secondly, chances are very good that you'll create an environment where intimacy, which requires emotional safety, will thrive. Here's a bonus benefit. You put the odds in your favor that you'll get an apology. If not now, then maybe later, instead of an argument. Either way, you honored yourself and how you felt, which contributes to becoming more confident. That's right. Saying ouch like a baby will give your grown-up self more inner strength than defending ever could. Number 3, listen without agreeing or disagreeing. For me, it was a revelation to discover that sometimes when my husband is talking, he's just talking. He's just thinking out loud. He doesn't always mean half of what he's saying. He's just trying things out. Therefore, I don't need to comment either way. For example, he might be telling me what he'd like to say to a nosy neighbor, but never actually would. In those situations, I have a magical phrase that I rely on. It's a way of saying, I'm listening without saying either I agree or I disagree. It's both respectful and conducive to intimacy. So here is that magical phrase. You ready? I hear you. I hear you. We all have a deep need to be heard and understood. And this phrase, I hear you, lets him know that you're listening. It's amazing how much stress that can relieve. Sure, you might be tempted to comment further or use the opportunity to make a point, but consider experimenting just for one evening with just listening. Once you get started with this phrase, you'll find yourself saying it to everyone, not just your spouse, but your boss, your kids, your friends. Here's a fringe benefit. It makes you a great conversationalist because it makes you a great listener. If any of these practices sound like the opposite of what you were taught about relationships, and if your parents don't have the kind of relationship you want to have, that's a pretty good sign you're on the right track. If you'd like to be my guest on the Empowered Wife podcast and share about how you fixed a struggling relationship using the 6 intimacy skills, I would love to interview you. Just go to lauradoyle.org/podcast-guest to let me know that you are willing to make a big contribution to ending world divorce by telling your relationship story. I look forward to meeting you. That's lauradoyle.org/podcast-guest. Heather, thank you so much for coming in and sharing with us on the challenge.
Hi, Laura. I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me.
So great. All right. Well, I just would love to know, start us off by sharing what your marriage was like before you knew what you know now.
Yeah. So I would say that everything was kind of smooth sailing until we moved in together once we got engaged. So probably about 6 years ago. And I started realizing that my husband was very stubborn. He didn't act the way that I thought he should act. And basically I realized, well, I didn't realize at that point, but I did have a lot of controlling tendencies. So we had some issues then, and they seemed to resolve themselves. And then we got married, and I had our daughter 3 years ago. And in having a child, it was like a complete change of routine, just state of mind, everything. And it didn't help that I was suffering with postpartum anxiety. I was working full time and I just felt like he should be helping out a lot more and he wasn't. So we had a lot of disagreements, a lot of disrespectful things that I said to him. I was latching on to bait all of the time, and it ultimately resulted in cold wars that would last 2 to 3 months. Like they were extremely long. To the point where I was mentally planning out, like, okay, I'm going to be a single mom. Like, what is that going to look like? I have this money stashed away in my bank account that I can use to, go find us a place to live. And it was just very depressing and not the relationship I had envisioned. Yet I kind of felt like I was doomed from the start because we were both children of divorce. And I thought, well, we don't even know how to replicate a good marriage. So we're just, we're not going to make it.
Oh, it sounds heartbreaking. It sounds lonely. Also sounds super exhausting to not only have a new baby and postpartum and be working full time, but also to be having all this stress in your marriage.
Yeah. And I really felt like I had to be superwoman. I had to be the perfect wife, the perfect mom, the perfect employee. And I just was so run down, and my self care was like non existent, that I soon realized once I read your book, actually at the recommendation of a mom's group that I had joined online. Once I read your book, I just was like, it was eye opening, right? Because I was like, all this time I've been doing all this stuff for my family to try to make things perfect, yet I've neglected myself and forgot what's made me happy. And I just wasn't my best self.
And your family was falling apart, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of giving you the opposite of what you thought was going to happen.
Exactly. Yeah.
And and I really, I so relate to you about being a child of a broken home. You're following a failed recipe, and you're getting the same results that your parents got. So, so really, it sounds like a very dark time for you.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you got the book, and then what happened?
Yeah, so I got the book and I was just in such a dark place that I remember it was like a Friday afternoon and I had a preliminary. I reached out to the private coaching program and I had a preliminary call with Coach Mari. It's Mari Joe, right?
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, like, nothing else is working. So I'm just going to make this investment in myself and sign up for private coaching. So I want to say it was not even like a week later, I had my first session with Coach Geedy. And it was very, very helpful to have kind of the one on one coaching and like really analyzing situations and seeing like where I was going wrong, like what I was doing well, and even coming up with like quick fixes for self care. Because a lot of the times I see self care as like getting massage or getting my nails done, but I don't always have time for that. So coming up with that list at the ready for like quick self care fixes was a game changer for me.
What kinds of things did you have on your list? Do you have a small child, right? So
Yeah.
what else could you do besides getting your nails done?
Yeah. So just calling a friend or my mom for 10 minutes and talking to her during the day, or listening to one of your podcasts on the way to the gym. I did that a lot and I still do that. Or sitting down with a hot cup of coffee or tea, just really relishing the small things in life that I found myself often overlooking and not even seeing them as self care, or even just like sitting in the sunlight for 10 minutes.
Wow. So you started doing these things. I mean, did that have an impact? Your hole was pretty big already, it sounds like.
It did, yes.
It
And it
did.
definitely, it definitely took time. It was not like an overnight fix. I mean, I would say the self care definitely helped me immediately because I just didn't have any. But in terms of our relationship and our marriage, I want to say it took a good like 2 to 3 months to see any difference. And I think it's because I had shown my husband so much disrespect that he was hurt deep down. And he's actually a child of abuse. So when he gets hurt, like emotionally, he just retreats, right? Like that's his defense mechanism is just, I don't want to engage with you or be around you at all. So it took a while for him to trust me again. And it was only, I think, like a couple months in that he made the comment that he felt like our marriage was in the best place that it had ever been.
Oh my gosh. You must have felt so good to hear those words.
Yeah, it felt like a great accomplishment. And like we were chatting
Yes.
about earlier, unfortunately, I was like, oh, I learned the skills. Like I'm all, like all my work is done. Like it's just going to stick forever. But a couple months back, I all of a sudden looked around and I'm like, wait a second, we're in a Cold War again. Like he's moved down to the basement.
Yeah.
He's sleeping down there. Like, what the heck happened? Like I had Laura Doyle like skills all figured out. And then I was like, oh, I'm not being held accountable and I'm slipping back into my old ways. And I really need some sort of support system to keep me on the right track.
Wow. So how did you give yourself that?
So then I reached out to Coach Kathy and joined the Ridiculously Happy Wife program. And the support was amazing. Everyone is so nice. And I love that the coaches will point us in the right direction of the module that we should listen to. And I told myself, like, if this works a second time, because my husband is a negative SFP, right? But he tends to be stubborn. So I was like, if this works again, then like I really want to enter the coach training program. So right now I'm trying to figure out how to express that desire to him and hopefully join the next program in the next couple of months.
Wow. Wow. I love it. So it sounds like you were, how long have you been in the Ridiculously Happy Wife program? No.
I think since April.
Okay. So you're just kind of new back April, May, June, July, August. Yeah.
Mhm.
So, and it sounds like, so what are things like in your relationship now?
They're amazing. So physical intimacy is like the best that it's ever been. I just posted in the group a couple days ago, but I can count, the number of times on one hand that he's woken up with our daughter on the weekends and like let me sleep in. And just for the heck of it, last weekend I was like, oh, I would really love to sleep in the morning. And he got up before I did. He fed her breakfast. He did the dishes in the sink, and it was all stuff that like I would love him to do. And it was super helpful. And I just continued to express gratitude in the hopes that, maybe something like that will happen again.
Yes. So you expressed your desires in a way that inspired him, which, by the way, is the cheap phrase we're going to work on tomorrow. And it sounds like he really was inspired.
Yeah. Yeah. And
He took action.
yeah. And he knows that I love getting flowers. And it's probably been like a year and a half since he brought me flowers. And so he did that like 2 weeks ago when he came back from a business trip. And one source of friction between us has always been my family and visiting them when we travel. And so this time we have a trip coming up in a couple of weeks, and I expressed, my desire to spend some additional time with one of my brothers. And he was like, well, why don't you invite him? Blah, blah, blah. Whereas before I would have been just asked my brother and not even told him, or like it just would have turned out bad.
So big differences.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So, well, this is amazing so he's not sleeping in the basement anymore, it sounds like.
No,
And how about the cold wars? You're still having those?
no, no more Cold Wars. Yeah, those are the worst. I don't wish them upon anyone.
No, they're so painful. I remember having them here too. They're awful.
Yeah.
And it doesn't sound like you have your mental plan to go be a single mom anymore.
No, no,
That's what I
not
heard
at
too.
all.
No, no. So and you made some pretty big decisions, big investments right away, it sounds like, in your marriage. What had you say yes to yourself so quickly?
So I think it was definitely in the spirit of knowing I needed self care and that the program would give me the self care that I needed and the guidance. But I also kept thinking too, like spending money on personal coaching or on private coaching rather, is a lot cheaper than a divorce attorney. And I didn't want to get to that point, and I really didn't want to put my daughter through what I had gone through as a child because it was just really hard and painful. And I still feel like my siblings and I are somewhat scarred from it. So really my commitment to her and, to keeping our family intact made me take the leap and make the decision to do it.
That's really moving. That is, you sound like a great mom, Heather.
Oh,
How,
thank you.
how old is your daughter?
She just turned 3.
She did. Okay. So how would you say this change in your marriage has impacted her, or has it? Is she just too little?
No, it definitely has because I was very criticizing of my husband's parenting toward her. I had an idea that, there was only one way to parent her and he was doing it wrong, which Coach Carol helped me realize like I don't know what it's like to be a father, right? Like I know how to mother, I don't know how to father. So, and that's on his paper. And I trust that he will make the best decision for her. And he ultimately just wants her to grow up to be a responsible, kind, loving person. So, parenting was something where I definitely released control. And I think that affected her a lot because now he has the opportunity to discipline her when he needs to. I was laughing with a friend because last weekend he wanted to take her out in the cul-de-sac to play with some neighbor kids. And he's like, should I put her clothes on because she had pajamas on? And I deep down, I was like, oh, don't bring her out in pajamas. Like, she just looks terrible. And I was just like, whatever you think. And so he brought her outside and they had a blast and she was in her pajamas. And I'm just like, I don't need to control that. Like, she is fine.
Oh my gosh, Heather, we just have to pause on this for a second. This is such a great example. And you weren't feeling it really at all when you said whatever you
Oh,
think. You were thinking, put her clothes on, please, right? I want to make a good impression on these other, maybe
yeah.
there's other adults around. And instead you chose whatever you think to not be too helpful and just trust him as a dad. So it sounds like he responded well to that, and it was a good outcome for him and your daughter. And then you were okay with it too, but by the end of it, it sounds like.
Yeah. And because do you know what I did while they were outside playing and he was watching her? I went and I folded laundry in peace and I listened to one of your podcasts.
So you got a little self-care while you were folding laundry, it sounds like.
Exactly.
And so how would that have gone in the past if you hadn't done a whatever you think?
I don't know that it would have turned into an argument, but I just would be like, what do you mean? You're going to take her outside in her pajamas? Like, that looks terrible. And then I think it would have turned into him being more controlling over me. So I know you've said this before, and I don't remember if it was on a podcast, but often when you feel like your husband is being controlling towards you, it's because they feel like they're lacking control in other areas, or maybe you're being too controlling over them. So I feel like some of that has been alleviated because I've just relinquished control of the things that I don't need to control, right?
Yeah, beautiful. It takes some courage to do that though, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's hard and it's not intuitive yet. I still feel like I have to think about it, which is fine, right? Because eventually it will be hopefully a muscle that I can exercise without even thinking about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's my experience. The longer I have my habits, the more they're just habits, like driving to the store. You don't have to think about how to get to the
Mhm.
store. Your car just goes there, right? You know what I mean? You get there, you don't even know how you got there. So those habits do sink in eventually. So, what would you say to yourself if you could go back in time and talk to Heather from before? What would you say to her that you know now?
I would say that there is not a certain way that relationships are supposed to look. I was going off of a broken model, right? My parents were divorced, but I had a lot of expectations that my future husband should do, like things that he should do or shouldn't do. Like he should be really close with my family. He should want to go see my parents whenever I want to because we live states away. He should carry my luggage when we go to the airport. All of these kind of like ingrained like rules almost that I had accumulated over the years, they were not helpful. And I think that I would tell myself, like, you can still have a beautiful relationship with
Mm.
the person that you're with by releasing all of those expectations that you have of them.
Mm. It's such a great point. I remember the same thing, just expecting my husband to behave a certain way. And when he didn't, it just seemed so jarring. I don't know where we get these expectations, but I love your point that you could still have a beautiful relationship, even the one you dreamed of, even if he's not showing up quite the way you imagined he would.
Exactly. And even if your husband isn't bringing you flowers every day or, taking you out for dinner, he's showing you love in other ways. It's just a matter of finding it and recognizing it and then enjoying it.
Yeah, well said. What's your tip, Heather, for someone who's listening now and maybe she's got cold wars and maybe she's pretty overwhelmed with working postpartum, having a baby, any young child, right? It's just a big they're tiring, those kids. They're tiring. So what's your tip for her if she's wondering how she can get to where you are, to where it feels easy and fun and connected again?
Definitely start with self care. I feel like as women, we do not prioritize self care as much because, at least for me, it made me feel guilty, right? Like I can't take time for myself. I have too many things to do. So, as hard as it is, make sure you start focusing on self care. And then I feel like the other things fall into place once you start working on them. Without the foundation of self care, you're not going to be able to keep duct tape on. You're not going to be able to relinquish control of things. And yeah, and I would highly recommend the private coaching too, just because I know for me personally, it was very beneficial and helped me identify blind spots that I didn't know I had.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've mentioned a number of coaches. You mentioned Coach Carol, Coach Mari. I think you've talked
Mhm.
about Coach Kathy. So you've had a variety of coaches from our campus, it sounds like. Is that
Mhm.
right? Yeah, between the group and the private coaching.
Yeah.
You've done both. So yeah, I love that. Well, I'm inspired by your story because you were mentally kind of out the door already. You were making some plans to leave. Instead, you've not only made your marriage last, it sounds like you've made it thrive, really fixed your family, and certainly has benefited, it sounds like you and your husband and your daughter. So, congratulations on your success.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for all the work that you do, Laura. It's amazing. And I am among, I know, numerous women who have you to thank for our marriages. So
I'm so happy we found each other because you inspire me also. If you'd like to be my guest on the Empowered Wife podcast and share about how you fixed a struggling relationship using the 6 intimacy skills, I would love to interview you. Just go to lauradoyle.org/podcast-guest to let me know that you are willing to make a big contribution to ending world divorce by telling your relationship story. I look forward to meeting you. That's lauradoyle.org/podcast-guest. And now it's time for the worst relationship advice of the week award.
It's the worst relationship advice of the worst relationship advice. Yeah, it's the worst relationship advice of the worst relationship advice of the week.
And the advice I find most regrettable this week is from a doctor who lists 25 bits of what she calls empowering relationship advice for women. But it's unfortunately full of conventional claptrap that can never work because it just doesn't take into account that part about how you can't change anybody but yourself. She just forgot that little detail. Here's what she says. She says, strive for equal effort. People always say relationships should be 50-50. That's wrong. They should be 100-100. Both people need to put in 100% effort every day to keep the relationship strong. It can't be 120, 150, or even 199. It has to be equal. If it gets out of balance, you need to have a conversation about that so you can get back on track. Blah, blah, blah. In other words, she suggests that you have a State of the Union address where you criticize him by pointing out that he's not putting in enough effort and you are putting in 100% effort and therefore he should do more. I tried that a bunch of times, so many times. You probably have too. But my complaining and criticizing, it never got me the kind of relationship that I have now where He can't stop kissing me and taking my picture, and he makes my tea every morning and hides the Quaker Oat Man around the house for me to find. Why the Quaker Oat Man? No one knows, but it's been a running gag at our house for years, and it's pretty silly. I know. But that's not how it was when I tried telling him he wasn't putting in enough effort by holding a State of the Union address. It was mostly wall-to-wall hostility and Cold Wars with no talking for days and no Quaker Oat men. These days, when I'm tempted to criticize him, that's my cue to make a list of all the things that my husband does to make my life wonderful. And it's a long list. So by the end of that, I'm not so worried about whatever it was I thought I should criticize him for. In other words, my urge to criticize is like a reminder that it's time to revisit my gratitude list. Something's out of whack, and that something is my attitude. Oh, sure, you can say, but my husband's not like that. I don't have many things on my gratitude list for my husband. I remember feeling the same way, but not anymore. I started with finding just 3 things a day to be grateful to him for. And from where I was focusing on everything I didn't have, well, this new focus was completely life-changing. And by that, I mean, everything got better. And one reason it got better was because I developed a new habit, a new discipline of focusing on what I was grateful for instead of what I didn't have. And what you focus on increases, in my experience. I never would have gotten to this glorious version of my marriage if I'd followed lame-brained advice like this one, where she tells you to have a conversation to focus on and complain about his lack of effort on the relationship, which is a very reliable way to cause distance or even an outright fight, in my experience. There's nothing admirable about complaining or criticizing. There's just no courage or humility needed to find fault. And for that reason, the advice that your relationship has to be equal, if it gets out of balance, you need to have a conversation about that so you can get back on track, is the very, very worst relationship advice I have heard all week. Listen and subscribe to the Empowered Wife podcast. And hey, if you're one of the hundreds of women who found this podcast valuable and you wrote a review on iTunes, I want to thank you so big. I'm so happy you did that. When you leave an anonymous rating and review, iTunes pays attention to that, and they push the podcast out to other women who wouldn't have heard about it otherwise. So if you left a review on iTunes or maybe one on Stitcher or on Amazon, I really appreciate you. The more reviews, the better. Thanks for contributing to the mission to end world divorce with your reviews and your ratings. I'm so grateful. On next week's podcast, I'll share how to cope when he's mentally ill. In the meantime, I hope you're having lots of fun. Today's fun fact is that on September 30th, John and I celebrated a ridiculously happy 32 years of marriage, which is my dream come true. Thank you for being a part of the community that made that possible for me. I'm so grateful.